Grace Sawyer heard the gunshot half a second before the stranger grabbed her arm and yanked her sideways into the alley. Her basket hit the ground, apples scattering across the dirt as a second shot punched into the saloon wall where she had been standing. The stranger pulled her behind a water trough, his body blocking hers, his hand still gripping her wrist with enough force to leave marks. She twisted against him, breath coming hard, and got her first clear look at his face. Weathered, sharp-edged, pale eyes that tracked the rooftops like a wolf hunting movement. He wore a gun belt low on his hip and a brown duster that had seen 1,000 miles of hard country. When those eyes finally dropped to hers, recognition hit her like a fist to the chest. Eli Hale. The name burned through her mind even as another shot cracked somewhere behind them. She knew that face. She had seen it once, years ago, in the worst moment of her life. He had been younger then, standing in the doorway of a burning ranch house with a smoking gun and a dead man at his feet. The man everyone said had started the fire. The man Grace knew had not. Eli released her wrist and drew his revolver in one smooth motion. He fired twice toward the rooftop across the street, then pulled her deeper into the alley. Grace stumbled after him, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had spent 5 years rebuilding her life in Willow Bend, 5 years keeping her head down and her past buried. And now this man, this bounty hunter, who knew what she had done, was dragging her through the dirt like she was cargo. They reached the back of the alley where it opened onto a side street. Eli stopped, listening, his breathing steady despite the chaos. Grace yanked her arm free and stepped back, putting space between them. Her voice came out low and sharp. "You." He glanced at her, no surprise in his expression. Just a flicker of something that might have been recognition, or maybe regret. Then, he holstered his gun and straightened, brushing dust from his duster. "Miss Sawyer. Figured you would remember me." His voice was rougher than she expected, like gravel under boots. Grace felt her hands shake and forced them still. She had built Larkspur Ranch from nothing, turned a failing piece of land into a horse breeding operation that supplied half the county. She had earned respect in this town through sweat and silence. And this man could destroy it all with a single conversation. "Why are you here?" It was not a question. Eli studied her for a moment, his gaze moving over her face like he was cataloging details. Then, he nodded toward the street where the shots had come from. "Those men were not shooting at me. They were shooting at you." Grace felt the words land cold in her stomach. She shook her head, but Eli was already moving, gesturing for her to follow. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run. But running would only confirm what he already suspected. So she followed, keeping 3 paces behind, her mind racing through possibilities, and none of them good. They reached the main street, and Eli stopped at the corner, scanning the crowd. People were emerging from doorways, drawn by the gunfire. Grace spotted Sheriff Taggart moving toward the saloon, his hand on his holster. Eli stepped back into the shadow of the building, pulling Grace with him. "Stay out of sight until Taggart clears the street. Those shooters are not local." "How do you know?" "Because I have been tracking them for 3 weeks. They are hired guns out of Denver. Someone paid them to come here." Grace felt her chest tighten. She forced herself to meet his eyes, to keep her voice steady. "What do they want?" Eli looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the calculation behind his gaze. He was deciding how much to tell her, how much he already knew. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. They want to make sure a certain fire from 5 years ago stays buried. And they want to make sure anyone who might talk about it does not. The world tilted. Grace pressed her hand against the rough wood of the building, her knees threatening to give. She had thought it was over. She had thought the lie had held. But if men were coming to kill her, it meant someone knew the truth. Or suspected it. And if Eli Hale was here, it meant the past was no longer past. I do not know what you are talking about. Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. Eli shook his head, something almost like sympathy crossing his face. Yes, you do. And we need to talk before those men try again. Grace wanted to refuse. She wanted to walk away and pretend this conversation had never happened. But the memory of those gunshots was still ringing in her ears, and the look in Eli's eyes told her that walking away would only make things worse. So she nodded once, sharp and reluctant. Where? My room at the boarding house. 1 hour. Come through the back. Then he was gone, stepping into the street like he belonged there, his duster swirling around his boots. Grace watched him go, her heart still pounding, her mind churning through everything she had spent 5 years trying to forget. She had been 18 when the fire happened. Young and stupid, and so desperate to prove herself that she had ignored every warning. Her father had been trying to save the ranch, borrowing money from a man named Voss, who had seemed kind at first, and then had turned vicious when the payments stopped coming. Grace had gone to Voss to beg for more time, and Voss had said yes, but only if she did him a favor. A small favor. Just deliver a message to a man at a ranch 20 miles out. She had delivered the message, and that night, the ranch had burned. 3 people had died, including the man she had delivered the message to. Grace had not known what the message said. She had not known Voss was setting a trap. But she had been the one to carry it, and that made her part of it. Complicit. Guilty. Eli Hale had been the bounty hunter hired to find the man who started the fire. He had tracked Voss to that burning ranch and put a bullet in him before Voss could escape. The town had called Eli a hero, and Grace had kept her mouth shut, because admitting what she had done would have destroyed her family and accomplished nothing. Voss was dead. The ranch was ash. And she had been too much of a coward to tell the truth. Now, 5 years later, someone wanted to make sure that truth stayed buried. And Eli Hale, the man who had killed Voss, was standing between her and a bullet. Grace made her way back through the side streets, avoiding the main road where people would stop her and ask questions. She reached Larkspur Ranch just as the sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The ranch sat on the edge of town, a collection of sturdy buildings surrounding a large corral where her horses moved in the fading light. She had 12 mares, 2 stallions, and a reputation for breeding animals that could handle rough country and rougher weather. Her foreman, a grizzled man named Chet, was waiting by the barn. He took one look at her face and frowned. Heard there was trouble in town. Grace nodded, forcing herself to sound calm. Someone took a few shots near the saloon. Sheriff is handling it. Chet spat into the dirt, his expression skeptical. You all right? Fine. I need to go back into town for a bit. Can you handle the evening feed? Chet nodded, but his eyes stayed sharp. Grace knew he did not believe her, but he was loyal enough not to push. She went into the small house she had built next to the barn, washed the dust from her face, and changed into a clean blouse. Then she checked the time and realized she had 40 minutes before she was supposed to meet Eli. She spent those minutes pacing the length of her kitchen, trying to decide if she was walking into a trap. Eli had saved her life today, but that did not mean he was on her side. Bounty hunters did not have sides. They had contracts. And if someone had hired him to finish what those shooters started, she was handing herself over on a plate. But if she did not go, she would never know what he wanted, or who had sent those men, or how much time she had before they tried again. So when the hour was up, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and walked back into town, moving through the alleys and back streets like a shadow. The boarding house sat on a quiet corner, a 2-story building with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Grace slipped around to the back and found the door Eli had mentioned. It was unlocked. She pushed it open and climbed the narrow stairs to the 2nd floor. Eli was waiting in the last room on the left. The door was ajar, and Grace pushed it open slowly, her hand tight on the edge of her shawl. The room was small and plain. Just a bed, a chair, and a washstand. Eli stood by the window, looking out at the street below. He had taken off his duster, and without it he looked leaner, harder. The gun belt was still on his hip. He turned when she entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Eli gestured to the chair. "Sit." Grace stayed standing. "I will hear what you have to say. Then, I am leaving." Eli nodded, accepting that. He moved away from the window and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. His voice was flat, businesslike. 5 years ago, I killed a man named Voss at a ranch outside of Copperfield. I was hired by the family of one of the men who died in that fire. They wanted justice. I gave it to them. Grace kept her face still, but her pulse was racing. Eli continued. "At the time, I thought Voss acted alone. He had a reputation for arson and extortion. The evidence pointed to him. But 6 months ago, a man came to me with new information. He said Voss was working for someone else. Someone who wanted that ranch burned because the owner had refused to sell. And he said there was a witness who could prove it. A young woman who delivered a message the night before the fire." Grace felt the room close in around her. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her voice steady. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because that man is dead now. Killed 2 weeks ago in Denver. And before he died, he told someone else about you. Someone who does not want the truth coming out." "Who?" Eli shook his head. "I do not know yet. But I know they hired men to make sure you do not talk. And I know you are the only person left who can connect Voss to whoever paid him." Grace swallowed hard. Her hands were shaking again, and this time she could not stop them. She sank into the chair, her legs no longer steady enough to hold her. "I did not know. I swear I did not know what that message was for." Eli watched her, his expression unreadable. Then he crouched down in front of her, bringing his eyes level with hers. His voice was quieter now, almost gentle. "I believe you." The words hit her like a physical blow. Grace stared at him, searching his face for a lie. But all she saw was a grim kind of understanding. Her throat tightened, and she looked away, blinking hard against the sting in her eyes. "Then why are they coming after me now? If Voss is dead, and the man who knew is dead, why do they care? Because someone is buying up land around Willow Bend. Big parcels. And Larkspur Ranch sits right in the middle of it. If you die, the ranch goes to auction. And whoever is behind this can buy it cheap. Grace looked up sharply. My ranch. Eli nodded. Your ranch. This is not just about keeping the past buried. It is about taking what you built. Rage flared in Grace's chest, hot and sharp. She had fought for every inch of Larkspur Ranch. She had worked herself to exhaustion, ignored the whispers and the judgment, turned a failing piece of land into something worth protecting. And now, someone wanted to kill her for it. Who was buying the land? I do not know yet. But I am going to find out. Grace stood, her hands clenched into fists. Her voice came out hard. Why do you care? You are a bounty hunter. You do not do this for free. Eli rose to his feet, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. Something that looked almost like guilt. You are right. I do not do this for free. But I also do not let innocent people die for crimes they did not commit. I got it wrong 5 years ago. I thought Voss was the end of it. But he was just the beginning. And if I let you die now, that is on me. Grace held his gaze, trying to read the truth in his face. She did not trust him. She did not trust anyone. But she also knew she could not fight this alone. And whether she liked it or not, Eli Hale was the only person who seemed to know what was coming. What do you want from me? Eli moved back to the window, looking out at the darkening street. His voice was steady, matter of fact. I want you to stay alive long enough for me to figure out who is behind this. That means staying close to town where people can see you. It means not going anywhere alone. And it means trusting me when I tell you something is dangerous. Grace let out a short, bitter laugh. Trust you? I do not even know you. Eli glanced back at her, and this time, there was a hint of something almost like humor in his expression. You know I am a good shot. And you know I pulled you out of the way today, instead of letting you take a bullet. That is more than most people can say. Grace shook her head, but she could not argue with the logic. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved toward the door. Fine. I will be careful. But I am not hiding. I have a ranch to run and contracts to fill. If someone wants me dead, they are going to have to work for it. Eli straightened, his eyes narrowing. That is exactly the kind of thinking that gets people killed. Grace turned to face him, her jaw set. I have spent 5 years living with what I did. I am not spending the rest of my life running from it. For a moment, Eli just looked at her. Then, he nodded, slow and thoughtful. All right. Then we do this your way. But I am staying close, and if I tell you to move, you move. Understand? Grace held his gaze for a long beat, then nodded once. Understood. She left without another word, slipping back down the stairs and into the night. The air was cool now, smelling of dust and distant rain. Grace walked back to the ranch, her mind churning through everything Eli had told her. Someone wanted her land. Someone wanted her dead. And the only person standing between her and a bullet was a man who had killed the last person she had trusted. The irony was not lost on her. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of shouting. She pulled on her boots and ran outside to find Chet standing by the corral, his face red with anger. 3 of her horses were gone. The gate was open, the latch broken, and in the dirt, someone had carved a single word with the heel of a boot. Leave. Grace felt ice slide down her spine. Chet was already checking the fence line, looking for tracks. Grace moved to the gate, her hands shaking as she examined the latch. It had not been broken by accident. Someone had pried it open with a tool, then smashed it to make it look like the horses had kicked their way out. Chet came back, his jaw tight. Tracks head north toward the canyon. 3 riders, maybe 4. They took your best mare and the 2 yearlings you were training for the Hendersons. Grace closed her eyes, forcing herself to think. The Hendersons had paid half up front for those horses. If she did not deliver them in 2 weeks, she would lose the contract and the money. And if word got out that her stock was being stolen, no one would trust her to deliver on time. Saddle my horse. I am going after them. Chet shook his head. Not alone you are not. I will come with you. No. I need you here in case they come back for the rest. Get word to Sheriff Taggart. Tell him what happened. Chet looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded and headed for the barn. Grace went into the house and changed into riding clothes, pulling on a split skirt and a sturdy jacket. She checked the rifle that hung over the door, loaded it, and slung it across her back. Then she went out to where Chet had saddled her horse, a tough little bay mare named Rosie. She was about to mount when a voice came from behind her. You are not going alone. Grace turned to find Eli standing at the edge of the yard, his horse already saddled. He was wearing his duster again, and the gun belt sat low on his hip. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard. How did you know? I was watching the ranch. Saw the riders leave just before dawn. Followed them long enough to mark their trail, then came back. Grace wanted to tell him to leave. She wanted to handle this herself, to prove she did not need his help. But 3 men against 1 woman with a rifle was not good odds, and she knew it. Fine. But I lead. Those are my horses. Eli nodded and swung into his saddle. Grace mounted Rosie and kicked her into a trot, heading north toward the canyon. The sun was climbing now, burning off the morning chill. The trail was easy to follow at first, 3 sets of hoof prints cutting through the soft dirt. But as they rode deeper into the canyon, the ground turned rocky, and the tracks scattered. Eli pulled up beside her, scanning the canyon walls. His voice was low. They are trying to lose the trail. That means they know someone might follow. Grace dismounted and crouched by the rocks, looking for scrapes or displaced stones. She found a trace, a small streak of fresh mud on a flat rock where a horse had stepped. She pointed north, deeper into the canyon. That way. They rode for another hour, the canyon narrowing around them. The walls rose steep and red on either side, casting long shadows across the trail. Grace felt the weight of the rifle on her back, felt the tension coiling tighter in her chest. She had been in this canyon before, years ago, when she was first learning the land. It was a good place to hide, and a good place to set a trap. Eli must have been thinking the same thing, because he reached out and caught her reins, pulling Rosie to a stop. Hold. Grace looked at him, irritation flaring. But Eli was not looking at her. He was looking up at the canyon rim, his eyes narrowed. Then, Grace heard it. The faint rattle of a stone rolling down the slope. Someone was up there, watching them. Eli dismounted in one smooth motion and pulled his rifle from its scabbard. He moved to the side of the trail, pressing against the canyon wall, and gestured for Grace to do the same. She slid off Rosie and led the mare into the shadow of an overhang, her heart hammering in her chest. For a long moment, Nothing happened. Then a voice echoed down from the rim, rough and mocking. "You should have stayed home, lady. This is not your business anymore." Grace stepped out into the open, her rifle raised. Her voice rang clear and hard through the canyon. "Those are my horses. That makes it my business." Laughter echoed from above. Then a shot cracked, and a bullet punched into the dirt 3 feet from Grace's boots. She dove back into cover, her breath coming fast. Eli was already moving, climbing the slope with a hunter's precision. He fired twice, and Grace heard a shout of pain from above. Grace climbed after him, using the rocks for cover. She heard more shots, heard the sharp crack of bullets hitting stone. Then she reached the top of the slope and saw them. 3 men, rough-looking and armed, crouched behind a line of boulders. One was bleeding from his shoulder, where Eli's bullet had caught him. Another was aiming down at the trail, trying to get a clear shot at their horses. Grace raised her rifle and fired. The shot went wide, but it was close enough to make the man flinch and duck. Eli used the distraction to move closer, his revolver drawn now. He fired once, and the bleeding man went down hard. The other 2 scattered, running for their horses tied further up the canyon. Eli started after them, but Grace shouted, "The horses! They are driving my horses deeper in." Eli stopped, his jaw tight. He looked at the fleeing men, then back at Grace. Then he nodded and ran back down the slope. Grace followed, her legs burning. They reached their horses and mounted quickly, pushing deeper into the canyon. The trail opened into a wide basin, and there, milling nervously, near the far wall, were Grace's 3 horses. The 2 remaining thieves were trying to drive them out through a narrow gap in the rocks. Grace kicked Rosie into a gallop, her rifle forgotten now. She reached the gap first and blocked it, forcing the thieves to pull up short. Eli came in from the side, his gun aimed steady at the nearest man. "Let the horses go." The man looked at Eli, then at Grace, then back at Eli. He spat into the dirt. "You do not know what you are getting into, bounty hunter. This is bigger than some stolen stock. I know exactly what I am getting into. Now drop your guns and ride out, or I drop you here." The man hesitated, his hand hovering near his holster. Then the second thief, younger and less steady, made a grab for his gun. Eli fired, and the young man went down with a bullet in his leg. The first man raised his hands, slow and deliberate. "All right. All right. We are done." Eli gestured with his gun. "Ride." The 2 men mounted and rode out through the gap. The wounded one slumped in his saddle. Grace watched them go, her chest heaving. Then she turned to her horses, moving slowly so as not to spook them. She caught the led mare's halter and ran her hand down the mare's neck, murmuring soft reassurances. The other 2 followed, calming as Grace's presence settled them. Eli holstered his gun and moved to her side. His voice was quiet. "You all right?" Grace nodded, still focused on the horses. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline draining out of her. She had fired a gun at another person today. She had chased thieves into a canyon and nearly gotten herself killed. And she had done it all because she refused to let someone take what was hers. Eli watched her for a moment, then reached out and steadied her hand with his own. The touch was brief, almost impersonal, but Grace felt the warmth of it like a brand. She looked up at him, and for the first time, She saw something in his eyes that was not calculation or suspicion. It was something closer to respect. You did good. Grace pulled her hand back, her face flushing. She turned away, focusing on gathering the horses. We should get back before someone else shows up. They rode back through the canyon in silence, the stolen horses trailing behind on lead ropes. The sun was high now, blazing down on the red rocks. Grace felt the exhaustion settling into her bones, but she kept her back straight and her eyes forward. She was not going to show weakness. Not in front of him. When they reached the ranch, Chet was waiting with Sheriff Taggart. The sheriff was a heavy man with a walrus mustache and a skeptical expression. He took one look at Grace and Eli and shook his head. Heard you went after them alone. That was foolish. Grace dismounted and handed Rosie's reins to Chet. Her voice was flat. I got my horses back. That is all that matters. Taggart grunted and turned his attention to Eli. And you? What is your interest in this? Eli swung down from his saddle, his face impassive. I am protecting a witness. Taggart's eyes narrowed. A witness? To what? To a murder 5 years ago. And to the people who are trying to cover it up now. Grace felt her stomach drop. She shot Eli a sharp look, but he was not looking at her. He was watching Taggart, waiting for the sheriff's reaction. Taggart was silent for a long moment, his jaw working. Then, he spat into the dirt. You are talking about the Copperfield fire. Eli nodded. I am. Taggart looked at Grace, his expression unreadable. Then, he sighed and rubbed his face. This is bigger than stolen horses, is not it? A lot bigger. Taggart swore under his breath. He looked at Grace again, and this time there was something almost like pity in his eyes. You should have come to me. Grace lifted her chin, her voice steady, and said what? That I delivered a message 5 years ago and now someone wants me dead for it. You would have laughed me out of your office. Taggart did not argue. He just shook his head and turned back to Eli. I will look into who is buying up the land. But I cannot protect her 24 hours a day. If someone wants her dead, they will find a way. Eli's voice was cold. Then, I will protect her. Taggart looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. See that you do. He left, riding back toward town. Chet took the horses to the corral, and Grace stood alone in the yard with Eli. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice low. You should not have told him. He needed to know. And you need allies, whether you like it or not. Grace shook her head, anger flaring. I do not need allies. I need to be left alone to run my ranch. Eli stepped closer, his eyes hard. You do not get that choice anymore. Someone wants you dead. And until I find out who, you are stuck with me. Grace met his gaze, her jaw set. I did not ask for your help. No. But you are going to take it anyway. They stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Then Grace turned and walked into the house, slamming the door behind her. She was not going to cry. She was not going to break. But the weight of it all was pressing down on her like a stone, and she did not know how much longer she could hold it up. That night, Grace lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. She could hear the horses moving in the corral, hear the wind rattling the shutters. And somewhere out in the dark, she knew Eli was watching. He had set up camp near the barn, refusing to leave. She had told him it was not necessary. He had ignored her. Part of her was furious. Part of her was terrified. And a very small, very stubborn part of her was grateful. She did not trust him. But she was starting to believe he meant what he said. And that was more dangerous than anything else. The next 3 days passed in a tense, exhausting rhythm. Grace worked the ranch, training horses and filling orders, while Eli shadowed her like a ghost. He never got in her way, but he was always there, watching the road, checking the fences, keeping his gun close. At night, he slept in the barn, and Grace told herself she did not care. But she found herself listening for his footsteps, found herself glancing out the window to make sure he was still there. It was maddening. It was also the only thing keeping her sane. On the 4th day, a telegram arrived from Denver. Eli read it standing in the yard, his face going hard. Grace saw the shift and walked over, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" Eli folded the telegram and looked at her. His voice was flat. "I know who is buying the land. And I know why they want you dead." Grace felt her breath catch. "Who?" "A man named Harlan Cross. He owns half the railroads in Colorado. He is buying up land for a new line that will run straight through Willow Bend. Your ranch sits right on the proposed route." Grace felt the world tilt. A railroad. That was why they wanted her gone. That was why they had tried to scare her, steal her stock, and finally kill her. Because she was standing in the way of a fortune. How much is he offering for land? Double market value. But only if the sellers cooperate. If they refuse, he has other methods. Like murder. Eli nodded, his jaw tight. Like murder. Grace turned away, her hands clenched into fists. She had spent 5 years building this ranch. She had poured everything she had into it. And now, some rich man from Denver wanted to take it away because it was inconvenient. Not going to happen. Eli moved to her side, his voice low. "Grace, this is not a fight you can win. Cross has money, lawyers, and hired guns. If you stand in his way, he will bury you." Grace turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "Then let him try. I am not selling. I am not leaving. And I am not letting him take what I built." Eli looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Something that looked almost like admiration. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate. "All right. Then we do this the hard way." "What is the hard way?" "We go public. We tell everyone in Willow Bend what Cross is doing. We make it so loud and so public that he cannot make you disappear without everyone knowing why." Grace felt a flicker of hope, sharp and fragile. "You think that will work?" "I think it is the only chance you have. Cross is counting on secrecy. If we take that away, he loses his leverage." Grace nodded, her mind already racing through the plan. They would need witnesses. They would need proof. And they would need to do it fast, before Cross sent more men. "When?" "Tomorrow. There is a town meeting at the church. Everyone will be there. We make the case in front of the whole town." Grace felt her chest tighten. Going public meant admitting what she had done 5 years ago. It meant facing the judgment and the whispers and the possibility that the town would turn on her. But it also meant fighting back. And that was the only thing she knew how to do. "All right. Tomorrow. That night, Grace sat at her kitchen table with Eli, writing out everything she remembered about the fire. Every detail, every name, every moment that had led to that terrible night. Eli listened, without interrupting, his face grim. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. That is enough. That is more than enough. Grace looked down at the pages, her handwriting shaky in places. She felt raw, exposed. But she also felt something else. Something that might have been relief. What if they do not believe me? Eli met her eyes, his voice steady. They will believe you. Because I will be standing next to you. And because the truth has a weight that lies do not. Grace wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that standing up would be enough. But she had spent 5 years hiding, and the fear of exposure was bone deep. What if it is not enough? What if Cross still comes after me? Eli reached across the table and took her hand. The touch was deliberate this time, not brief or impersonal. His hand was warm, calloused, steady. And when he spoke, his voice was low and fierce. Then I will be there, and I will not let him hurt you. Grace felt something crack inside her chest. She looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast of his rough skin against hers. She had spent so long being strong, being careful, being alone. And now this man, this stranger who knew her worst secret, was offering her something she had not let herself want. Protection, partnership, trust. She pulled her hand back slowly, but not unkindly. Her voice was quiet. Why do you care? Really? You do not owe me anything. Eli was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned back, his gaze distant. 5 years ago, I killed a man I thought was guilty. I did my job. I got paid. And I walked away. But a few months ago, I found out that man was not working alone, that there was someone else pulling the strings, and that I had let them get away. I do not make that mistake twice. Grace studied his face, seeing the guilt etched into the lines around his eyes. He was not doing this just for her. He was doing it for himself, for the man he had killed, for the justice he had failed to find. And somehow, that made it easier to trust him. All right. Tomorrow, we tell the truth. Eli nodded. Tomorrow. The next morning, Grace dressed carefully in her best blouse and cleanest skirt. She braided her hair with steady hands, even though her stomach was churning. Eli was waiting by the barn, his duster brushed clean, his gun belt polished. He looked every inch the bounty hunter, hard and dangerous. But when he saw her, his expression softened, just slightly. Ready? Grace nodded, even though she was not sure that was true. They rode into town together, side by side, and the sight of them drew stares. People knew Eli by reputation now. And people knew Grace as the woman who kept to herself, who worked harder than anyone, who never caused trouble. Seeing them together was enough to start the whispers. The church sat at the center of town, a simple wooden building with a cross on the roof. By the time they arrived, the pews were already filling. Grace recognized faces. The Hendersons. The Morrisons. Old Mrs. Chen, who ran the general store. Sheriff Taggart standing near the back, his arms crossed. And standing near the front, tall and immaculate in a tailored suit, was a man Grace had never seen before. But she knew who he was. Harlan Cross. He had come to see this for himself. Grace felt her pulse spike, but she forced herself to walk down the aisle with her head high. Eli stayed close, his presence a steady anchor. They reached the front, and the preacher, a kind-faced man named Reverend Miles, gestured for silence. "We are here today to discuss matters affecting our town. Miss Sawyer has asked to speak. I think we should hear her out." Grace stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces she had worked beside for 5 years. And then, she began. "5 years ago, I made a mistake. I was young and desperate, and I trusted the wrong person. A man named Voss asked me to deliver a message to a ranch outside Copperfield. I did not know what the message said. I did not know it was a signal for arson. But that night, the ranch burned. 3 people died, and I have carried that guilt ever since." The crowd was silent, every eye on her. Grace forced herself to continue. "Voss was killed by a bounty hunter. I thought it was over, but it was not. Voss was working for someone else, someone who wanted that land, and now that same person wants my land. He has sent men to steal my horses, to scare me, and to kill me, because my ranch stands in the way of his railroad." She looked directly at Harlan Cross. His face was smooth, unreadable, but his eyes were cold. "That man is Harlan Cross, and I am not the only one he is targeting. He is buying up land all over this county, and anyone who refuses to sell is being threatened, or worse. I am here today to say that I will not be intimidated. I will not sell, and I will not let him take what I built." The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Then, Harlan Cross stood, his voice smooth and cultured. "Miss Sawyer, I sympathize with your difficulties, but you are making serious accusations without proof. I am a businessman. I negotiate fairly. If your ranch is in the path of progress, I am prepared to offer you a generous price." Grace felt fury rising in her chest. "I do not want your money. I want my land." Cross smiled, cold and patronizing. "Then, I am afraid we have nothing to discuss." Eli stepped forward, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You are right. You do not have anything to discuss. Because Miss Sawyer has witnesses. She has proof. And she has me. If anything happens to her, the law will know exactly where to look." Cross's smile did not waver, but his eyes hardened. "Is that a threat?" "Mr. Hale, it is a promise." The crowd began to murmur, voices rising. Sheriff Taggart pushed through to the front, his face dark. "Cross, if what Miss Sawyer says is true, you will answer for it." Cross straightened his suit, his expression icy. "I have done nothing illegal, Sheriff, and I have the lawyers to prove it. But I will say this. Progress does not wait for sentiment. This town will have a railroad, with or without Miss Sawyer's cooperation." He turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Grace felt her knees go weak, but Eli's hand was on her elbow, steadying her. The crowd erupted, voices overlapping. Some people looked angry. Some looked frightened, but a few, a handful, looked at Grace with something that might have been respect. Reverend Miles raised his hands for quiet. We will discuss this further. But for now, Miss Sawyer has spoken her truth, and we owe her the courtesy of believing her until proven otherwise. The meeting dissolved into arguments and side conversations. Grace let Eli guide her out of the church, her legs shaking. They made it to the horses before she finally stopped, leaning against Rosie's warm flank. I did it. I told them. Eli nodded, his face serious. You did. And now Cross knows you are not backing down. That makes you more dangerous to him. Which means the real fight is just starting. Grace looked up at him, her chest tight. I know. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the weight of what came next hanging between them. Grace knew that Cross would not give up. He would send more men. He would find another way. But for the first time in 5 years, she felt like she was fighting back instead of hiding. And that made all the difference. That night, a storm rolled in. Grace stood on her porch, watching the lightning flicker across the horizon. Eli was by the barn, checking the horses one last time before the rain hit. She saw him move through the corral, efficient and careful, and something twisted in her chest. He had saved her life. He had stood beside her in that church. And he had not asked for anything in return. She walked out to the barn, the first drops of rain starting to fall. Eli looked up as she approached, his hair already damp. You should get inside. This is going to be a bad one. Grace shook her head. I wanted to thank you. For today. Eli straightened, his eyes searching her face. You do not need to thank me. Yes, I do. You did not have to stand up for me. You did not have to put yourself in Cross's sights. But you did. And I need you to know that I see that. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped closer, and Grace felt her breath catch. He was close enough that she could see the rain beating on his duster, could see the flicker of something raw in his eyes. I did not do it because I had to. I did it because I wanted to. Grace felt the words settle between them, heavy and true. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she let herself see him. Not as a bounty hunter, not as a threat, but as a man who had chosen to stand beside her when no one else would. Why? Eli reached up and brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, his touch gentle. His voice was low, almost rough. Because you are worth fighting for. Grace felt her heart slam against her ribs. She wanted to step back, to protect herself, to keep the walls up. But she was tired of being afraid, tired of being alone. So instead, she stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Eli went still, his hand still hovering near her cheek. Then, slowly, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not gentle. It was fierce and desperate and full of everything they had not said. Grace kissed him back, her hands fisting in his duster. And for a moment, the storm and the danger and the fear all disappeared. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eli rested his forehead against hers. His voice was barely a whisper. This complicates things. Grace let out a shaky laugh. Everything is already complicated. Eli smiled, a real smile this time, and Grace felt something warm and fragile unfold in her chest. She did not know what came next. She did not know if they would survive what Cross was planning. But she knew that she was not alone anymore. And that was enough. The storm lasted through the night, and by morning the ranch was a sea of mud. Grace woke early, her mind already racing through everything that needed to be done. She had horses to train, fences to check, and a town full of people who now knew her darkest secret. But when she stepped outside, she found Eli already working. He had mucked out the stalls, checked the water troughs, and was now repairing a section of fence that had blown down in the storm. Grace walked over, her arms crossed against the morning chill. Eli looked up, his hand still working the wire. "Morning." Grace nodded, something warm settling in her chest. "You did not have to do all this." "I know. But I figured you had enough to worry about." Grace watched him work for a moment, then picked up a hammer and started helping. They worked in silence, side by side, and it felt easy, natural, like they had been doing this for years instead of days. By noon, Chet arrived with news. He looked grim. "Sheriff wants to see you both. Says it is urgent." Grace and Eli exchanged a glance, then mounted and rode into town. They found Taggart at his office, a telegram in his hand. He looked up as they entered, his face heavy. "Cross has filed a lawsuit. He is claiming you are in breach of a contract to sell." Grace felt her stomach drop. "I never signed a contract." Taggart handed her the telegram. "He has a document with your signature on it. Or something that looks like your signature." Grace stared at the paper, her hands shaking. It was a forgery. It had to be. But it was good. Good enough that a judge might believe it. Eli leaned over her shoulder, his jaw tight. "When is the hearing?" 3 days. In Denver. Grace felt the walls closing in. She could not afford a lawyer. She could not afford to lose 3 days when the ranch needed her. And if Cross won, she would lose everything. Eli's voice was flat, dangerous. He is trying to bury her in legal fees and delays. If she fights, she loses. If she does not fight, she loses. Taggart nodded slowly. "That is about the size of it." Grace looked at Eli, her chest tight. "What do I do?" Eli turned to face her, his eyes hard. "We go to Denver, and we prove that contract is a fake. I know people who can help. People who owe me favors." Grace wanted to believe him, but the weight of it all was crushing. She sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "I cannot keep fighting this. Every time I turn around, there is something new. How long before he wins?" Eli crouched in front of her, his hands on her knees. His voice was fierce. "He does not win. Not while I am here. We go to Denver. We fight this. And we come back. Together." And we come back. Together. Grace looked up at him and saw the determination in his eyes. She saw the man who had stood beside her in the church, the man who had kissed her in the rain, the man who was not going to let her fall. "All right. We go to Denver." They left the next morning, riding hard for the train station 30 miles east. The trip took most of the day, and by the time they reached the station, the sun was setting. Eli bought tickets with the last of his cash, and they boarded the evening train to Denver. The train car was crowded, filled with miners and merchants and families heading west. Grace found a seat by the window and watched the landscape roll past. Eli sat beside her, his duster draped over the seat, his gun belt hidden under his coat. He looked like any other traveler. But Grace knew better. She leaned her head against the window, exhaustion pulling at her. Eli's voice was low. "Get some sleep. We have a long fight ahead." Grace closed her eyes, but sleep would not come. Her mind kept churning through possibilities, through worst-case scenarios. She felt Eli shift beside her, felt his hand settle on hers. The touch was warm, grounding. And slowly, the tension began to ease. She did sleep. Eventually. And when she woke, the train was pulling into Denver. The city was huge, sprawling, nothing like Willow Bend. Grace felt small and lost in the crowd as they disembarked. But Eli moved through the station with the confidence of a man who had been here before. He led her to a boarding house on the edge of town, paid for 2 rooms, and then took her to a small office tucked between a saloon and a print shop. Inside, a narrow-faced man with ink-stained fingers looked up from a desk covered in papers. His eyes widened when he saw Eli. "Hale, I heard you were dead." Eli smiled thinly. "Not yet. I need a favor." The man leaned back, his expression wary. "What kind of favor?" "The kind that involves proving a forged contract and taking down a railroad baron." The man let out a low whistle. "You do not ask for small favors, do you?" "Never have." The man looked at Grace, then back at Eli. Then he sighed and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "All right. Tell me everything." They spent the next 2 hours laying out the case. The man, whose name was Porter, was a document expert. He had worked for the courts, for the railroads, and for anyone else who could pay. But he owed Eli a debt from years back, and he was willing to help. By the time they left, Porter had promised to examine the contract and testify if needed. It was not much. But it was a start. Grace and Eli walked back to the boarding house through streets lit by gas lamps. The city felt loud and overwhelming after the quiet of Willow Bend. Grace kept close to Eli, her nerves stretched tight. She felt exposed here, like Cross could reach her more easily in the crowd. As if reading her mind, Eli's hand found hers. He did not say anything, just laced his fingers through hers and kept walking. And Grace felt the fear ease, just a little. That night, she lay awake in her small room, listening to the sounds of the city. She thought about the ranch, about Chet holding things together while she was gone, about the horses that needed training and the contracts that needed filling, and about the man sleeping in the room next door, who had turned her life upside down and somehow made her feel safer than she had in years. The hearing was set for the next afternoon. Grace dressed in her best clothes, borrowed a hat from the boarding house landlady, and tried to look like someone who belonged in a courtroom. Eli met her downstairs, his duster replaced by a dark coat that made him look almost respectable. Almost. Porter was waiting outside the courthouse, a leather satchel under his arm. He looked nervous but determined. "I found something. The ink on that contract is less than 6 months old. No way it was signed 5 years ago like Cross claims." Grace felt a flicker of hope. "Will the judge believe you?" Porter shrugged. "Depends on how good Cross's lawyers are. But I have the evidence. That is all I can give you." They went inside, climbing the steps to a wood-paneled courtroom. Cross was already there, flanked by 3 lawyers in expensive suits. He looked calm, confident. When he saw Grace, he smiled. It was not a kind smile. The judge entered, an older man with a lined face and sharp eyes. He called the hearing to order, and Cross's lead lawyer stood. He laid out the case smoothly, presenting the forged contract as evidence. He argued that Grace had agreed to sell, then reneged, and that Cross was entitled to enforce the agreement. Grace felt sick listening to the lies presented as fact. Then, it was Porter's turn. He stood, nervous but clear, and explained his findings. He showed the ink analysis. He pointed out inconsistencies in the signature. He built the case, piece by piece. The judge listened, his expression unreadable. Then he asked Grace to testify. She stood, her legs shaking, and walked to the stand. The lawyer asked her question after question, trying to trip her up to make her look unreliable. But Grace held steady. She told the truth. All of it. The fire. The message. Voss. Cross. Everything. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge leaned back, his fingers steepled. Then he spoke, his voice dry. Mr. Cross, this court finds the evidence of forgery compelling. The contract is void. Miss Sawyer is under no obligation to sell. Grace felt the world tilt. She had won. Cross's face went dark, his lawyers whispering urgently. But the judge was already standing, the hearing over. Eli was at her side immediately, his hand on her back. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had won. She had fought, and she had won. Porter grinned, shaking her hand. Congratulations, Miss Sawyer. You just beat a railroad baron. Grace laughed. The sound shaky, but real. Thank you. I could not have done it without you. They left the courthouse together, the late afternoon sun warm on their faces. Grace felt lighter than she had in years. But Eli's expression was serious. This is not over. Cross will try something else. He is not the kind of man who gives up. Grace nodded, her smile fading. I know. But for today, I won. And that is enough. They caught the evening train back to Willow Bend, arriving late the next day. Chet met them at the ranch, his face splitting into a rare grin when he saw them. Heard you won. Grace dismounted, exhaustion and relief washing over her. We did. The contract was fake. Cross cannot touch the ranch. Chet nodded, satisfied. Then he looked at Eli, his expression thoughtful. You planning on staying? Eli glanced at Grace, and something passed between them. Then he nodded. For now. Chet grunted and went back to the barn. Grace stood alone with Eli in the yard, the stars beginning to appear overhead. She felt the weight of the last week settling on her shoulders, but it was not crushing anymore. It was just tired. Eli stepped closer, his voice low. You should get some rest. Grace looked up at him and saw the same exhaustion in his eyes. But she also saw something else, something that looked like hope. Stay. Tonight. Do not go back to the barn. Eli went still. Then he nodded, slow and careful. All right. They went into the house together, and Grace felt the walls that had held her together for so long finally begin to crack. She was not alone anymore. She did not have to be. That night, they sat by the fire, not talking, just being. And when Grace finally fell asleep, Curled up on the sofa with Eli's coat draped over her, she felt safe for the first time in 5 years. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of work and waiting. Grace threw herself into the ranch, training horses and rebuilding what had been damaged. Eli stayed close, helping where he could, keeping watch. They did not talk about what came next. They did not talk about what they were to each other. But the kiss in the rain hung between them, a promise neither of them was ready to name. Then, one morning, Sheriff Taggart rode out to the ranch. His face was grim. Cross is dead. Grace felt the words hit her like a blow. Eli straightened, his hand moving toward his gun. How? Shot in his hotel room 2 nights ago. No witnesses. But the word is, he was killed by one of his own men. Someone he double-crossed. Grace felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Cross was gone. The threat was over. But it did not feel like victory. It felt like the story was not finished. Taggart continued. The railroad company is dropping the claim on your land. They are rerouting the line north. You are clear. Grace let out a breath she did not know she was holding. It is over. Taggart nodded. It is over. He left, and Grace stood alone in the yard, staring at nothing. Eli came to stand beside her, his presence steady. How do you feel? Grace shook her head, a laugh bubbling up that was half relief and half disbelief. I do not know. I thought I would feel different. But I just feel tired. Eli smiled, a real smile, and reached for her hand. That is because you have been fighting for 5 years. It is going to take time to remember what peace feels like. Grace looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. And for the first time, she let herself ask the question she had been avoiding. What happens now? With us? Eli's smile faded, but his eyes stayed warm. That is up to you. Grace took a breath, steadying herself. Then, she said the words she had been too afraid to say. I want you to stay. Not just for now, but really, stay. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, and Grace felt the last of her walls crumble. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of leather and dust and something that was just him. I am not going anywhere. Grace held on tight and let herself believe it. The town meeting that followed was smaller, quieter. Reverend Miles stood at the front and announced that the railroad would not be coming through Willow Bend after all. The crowd erupted in cheers. Grace sat in the back with Eli, her hand in his, and felt the weight of 5 years finally lift. After the meeting, people came up to her. Mrs. Chen squeezed her hand. The Hendersons thanked her for standing up. Even old Taggart nodded his approval. Grace felt the warmth of it, the acceptance she had never thought she would earn. That evening, Grace and Eli stood on the porch of her house, watching the sun set over the ranch. The horses moved lazily in the corral. The air smelled of sage and rain, and everything felt possible. Eli turned to her, his voice soft. You know, I have spent most of my life chasing ghosts, hunting men who did not want to be found. I never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home. But this feels different. Grace looked up at him, her heart full. Different how? Eli smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reached his eyes. Like maybe I found where I am supposed to be. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. but they were good tears this time. She reached up and pulled him down, kissing him with everything she had. And when they finally pulled apart, breathless and smiling, she whispered the words she had been too afraid to say. "I love you." Eli rested his forehead against hers, his voice rough. "I love you too." They stood there, wrapped in each other, as the stars came out one by one. And for the first time in 5 years, Grace felt like she was home. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Eli took on more work around the ranch, his skills with horses proving sharper than Grace expected. He was patient with the young stock, firm but kind, and the animals responded to him. Chet grudgingly admitted he was useful, which from Chet was high praise. Grace found herself smiling more, laughing more. The weight she had carried for so long was gone, replaced by something lighter, something that felt like joy. One evening, as they worked side by side mending tack, Eli spoke without looking up. "I have been thinking about what comes next." Grace glanced at him, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" Eli set down the leather strap he was working on and met her eyes. "I mean, I am done chasing bounties. I am done hunting. I want to build something instead. Here. With you." Grace felt her breath catch. She set down her own work and moved closer. "You are serious?" Eli nodded, his expression steady. "I have never been more serious about anything in my life." Grace felt tears threaten again, but this time she did not fight them. She reached up and cupped his face, her voice shaking. "Then let us build it. Together." Eli kissed her, slow and deep, and Grace felt the last piece of her broken heart click into place. 2 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Grace and Eli stood in front of Reverend Miles, with half the town watching. Grace wore a simple dress borrowed from Mrs. Chen, cream-colored with lace at the collar. Eli wore his best shirt. No duster, no gun belt. Just a man standing beside the woman he loved. The ceremony was short and sweet. Reverend Miles spoke about love and trust, and the courage it takes to build a life together. And when he pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in applause. Chet stood at the back, his arms crossed, but Grace saw the hint of a smile on his weathered face. Sheriff Taggart tipped his hat. The Hendersons cheered, and Grace felt a sense of belonging she had never thought possible. Eli kissed her, and the world narrowed to just the two of them. When they finally pulled apart, he whispered against her ear, "Ready to start the rest of our lives?" Grace smiled, fierce and bright. "I have been ready for a long time." They walked out of the church hand in hand, into the sunlight, into the future they had fought so hard to claim. And as the town celebrated around them, Grace looked up at the man beside her and knew that she was finally, truly home. The ranch thrived over the next year. Grace and Eli worked together, training horses, filling contracts, and slowly expanding the operation. They built a new barn. They added fencing. They even took on a second hand, a young man named Thomas, who was eager to learn. Grace found that sharing the load made everything easier. Eli handled the difficult horses, the ones that needed a firm hand and endless patience. Grace managed the breeding program, matching bloodlines and planning for the future. And together, they built something that felt solid and real and theirs. On their first anniversary, Eli surprised her with a gift. He led her out to the new barn, where a beautifully crafted wooden sign hung over the door. It read, Sawyer and Hale, horse breeders. Grace stared at it, her throat tight, then turned and threw her arms around him. You did not have to do that. Eli held her close, his voice warm. Yes, I did. This is ours. Both of us. Equal. Grace pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes shining. I love you. So much. Eli kissed her forehead, his smile soft. I love you too. Now and always. They stood there, wrapped in each other, as the sun set over the ranch they had built together. And Grace knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that she had found what she had been searching for all along. Not just safety, not just acceptance, but love. Real, fierce, unshakable love. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers. There were difficult foals and broken fences, and the endless work that came with running a ranch. But Grace and Eli faced it all together, side by side. And that made all the difference. They had children eventually. A daughter with Grace's eyes and Eli's stubborn streak. A son who was quiet and thoughtful, and loved the horses as much as his parents did. The house filled with laughter and noise, and the kind of chaos that comes with a growing family. And through it all, Grace never forgot the girl she had been. The girl who had made a terrible mistake and spent 5 years running from it. But she also knew that girl was gone now. Replaced by a woman who had learned to forgive herself. A woman who had learned that love was not about being perfect. It was about being brave enough to try. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch was still, Grace and Eli would sit on the porch and watch the stars. And sometimes, Eli would reach for her hand and say the same thing he had said on their wedding day. Ready for the rest of our lives. And every time, Grace would smile and answer the same way. Always. Because she was. Because they had built something real and lasting and worth fighting for. And because,